Welcome to EPG Pathshala Philosophy. We are discussing one of the modules in social and political philosophy. The module is Gramsci and Althusser on Marx's relation between base and superstructure. One of the remarkable achievements of Marx is to bring a very radical transformation in social theory. Social philosophy or political philosophy till Hegel operated on a convergence axis, namely they all converged on the idea that it is the politics that governs or controls the society, the civil society. The rulers or political rulers are the ones who establish and execute what should be the life the people of their societies should lead. So in other words, it is an instance of top to bottom. Marx brought a radical change to this way of looking at this relation between politics and society by bringing to the notice that it is not the top, that is the political, that controls the bottom, that is the civil society. He rejected this clearly and he gave an alternative where it is the bottom that determines the politics at the top. Let's look at this thing carefully. Marx is not saying that top should become bottom and bottom should become top. No. There is that he retains the top, that is political, at the top, and he retains the bottom at the that is society at the bottom. He only reverses the direction, that is from saying the earlier view that it is the top that controls the bottom. He argued that it is the bottom that determines the top. This is a very radical way of looking at things. It changes the way of gazing at the political processes, social controls in a revolutionary manner. Okay. Now, while this has revolutionized the entire social theory, what became a problem, an enigma, is a term that he used, namely determinism. The determinism is problem, it is an enigma for several reasons. I will discuss some of them in this module. Determinism is an enigmatic expression in Marx because determinism is mechanical. If you say that something determines something else, that relation is governed by causality and there is a one-to-one correspondence that ensues in this process. For example, if I say that the switch determines the rotation of the fan or the lighting of the light, okay, there is a causal relation and that is a deterministic relation. Okay, whether it is possible, whether it is wieldy to maintain a determinism in human relation has become a serious problem. Okay, is it possible to talk about determinism in explaining, in analyzing human relations in society. That is the problem. So, what we are going to discuss in this module is about the use of the term determinism, whether the use of the term determinism fits well in the revolutionary change that is brought in by Marx, or whether there will be some problems, small or bigger, in the use of this term in understanding human relation is the issue here. So, one way of looking at the complexity of the use of the term determinism is to look at two ways of using this term. One, using this term determinism, or economic determinism to be more precise, in Marxism in a literal sense of the term, where one argues and one shows that there is indeed a causal relation, a mechanical relation, a deterministic relation between the base and the superstructure. The base at the bottom and superstructure at the top. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that the word determinism should not be read literally but figuratively. In other words, determinism does not mean mechanical process. It is not to be taken as literally but metaphorically or figuratively, where there indeed would be some exceptions, some loose aspects that govern the relation between base and superstructure. Now, these two interpretations are indeed possible, and they have not been authored after Marx but by Marx and Engels in their own writing. Let me quote what Engels says, which is a very important passage. I quote, "Marx and I," says Engels, "are ourselves partly to blame for the fact that young people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due to it. We have to emphasize," says Engels, "the main principles vis-a-vis our adversaries who denied it. We had not always the time, the place, or the opportunity to allow the other elements involved to come into their rights," unquote. Now, this is a fascinating passage from Engels on behalf of both Engels and Marx. It is fascinating because it, in a very important way, in a tactful manner, summarizes the two positions that I have just mentioned earlier. One is that there is a school of thought who looks at the word determinism in a mechanical and causal way, and there is also another school of thought which looks at this relation not in a mechanical and in a literal sense, but in a non-mechanical and figurative sense. Okay. Now, both Engels and Marx take responsibility for giving rise to these two important ways of looking at the same process differently. In other words, there is a hermeneutic place in this passage for these two versions. Now, let us look at this very carefully, this passage very carefully. One, Engels admits that Marx and himself ought to be partly blamed for the fact that young people, not all people, but young people. So he takes a blame for young people, not all the time, okay, but sometimes laying more emphasis on the economic side than due to it. So, in other words, he confesses that they take blame for this. But he gives a very important and interesting reason why they had given this impression, which made young people sometimes to stress more emphasis on economic aspect, is because that they were preoccupied in emphasizing the main principles vis-a-vis the adversaries who denied it. So look at this thing, that they authored determinism from this line, not because they wanted to author determinism, but they authored determinism because they wanted to emphasize the main principles in relation to their adversaries who rejected these main principles. So the exaggeration of associated with determinism is due to the fact that it is the adversaries who forced Marx and Engels to author determinism. And then he says, we had not always the time, place or opportunity to allow the other elements involved to come into their thoughts. So, a close reading of this very important passage will give us an idea of two kinds of relations that are associated with base and superstructure in Marx. With this background, let us look at how, for instance, two important post-structuralists, Gramsci and Althusser, looked at the relation between base and superstructure. Both Gramsci and Althusser have something very interesting. Gramsci and Althusser admitted that they are Marxist in total sense of the term, and they accept everything that Marx said, and they would not deviate anything from Marx. Yet, they also became the forefathers of postmodernism, which rejected Marxism. Okay, so you have two Marxists who claim that they are true Marxists, yet they become the icons, the foundational icons of postmodernism that rejected Marxism. So there's something very interesting that is associated with these two post-structuralist philosophers, social theorists, and the way in which they have been claimed by people within Marxism and outside Marxism, particularly those critics like postmodern philosophers. Okay, let us look at Gramsci carefully. Gramsci comes up with something very interesting. He says that when people talk about the relation between base and superstructure to be very deterministic, this is not in consonance with the writings of Marx. Because Marx did not say that base and superstructure can be understood as governed by determinism. What Marx seems to be saying is that there is whatever happens at the base will have fluctuations in superstructure. So it is not that base will determine superstructure, but the changes at the base gets fluctuated at the superstructure. Okay, so you cannot think that there is something that happens at the base and it will have an immediate expression of the structure at the superstructure level. He says if anybody maintains that everything that happens at base will be reflected automatically at superstructure, this must be contested in theory as primitive infantilism and combated in practice with the authentic testimony of Marx, the author of concrete political and historical works. And he quotes the works of the 18 Brumaire and the writings on the Eastern question, but also other writings like Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, the Civil War in France and lesser works. So he says that this is not acceptable. Okay, what is acceptable is that something that happens at the base gets fluctuated at the superstructure. And he gives the following arguments in support of this claim. The first argument that he gives is the following, which is, he says that it is very difficult at any given time to get statistically the structure, that there is a structure that is the base. Okay, he says that it is very difficult to get a statistical account of the base at any particular point of time. Now, let me elaborate this with an example. When I switch on a fan switch, now I know how much of power, I can know how much of power is released from the switch and how it passes through the wires and reaches the fan, which starts rotating. Okay, now I can have a statistical account of the power that is released from the switch and roughly the amount of power that reaches the fan. Now, Gramsci says that it is not possible to have a similar statistical account of the base to ascertain whether what happens at the base gets automatically reflected at superstructure. Okay, what, however, is possible is something that happens at the base, the tendencies of the developments can be deciphered at the superstructure. We can have a tendencies that visible in the superstructure. So it is not possible to have a statistical account. And the second point that he makes, which is very important in this context, is that some things might start at the base, and they may take some time for them to reach the superstructure. So it is not automatic, it is not instantaneous as it is in the case of switch and the fan. Some things might start at the base and they will take some time to reach the superstructure. So that is also, until they reach the superstructure, you cannot maintain that the relation is deterministic. And thirdly, that something might start at the base and might stop and not reach the superstructure at all. So you have three kinds of movements from the base. Some things might start from the base and reach the superstructure. Something might start from the base and might take some time to reach the superstructure. Some things might start and never reach. So given these kinds of possibilities, it is not possible to maintain that the relation between base and superstructure is deterministic, is mechanical, is governed by causality. The other point that he makes in rejecting economic determinism is the concept of error. Error for Gramsci is very complex. A particular political act, says Gramsci, may have been an error of calculation on the part of the leaders of the dominant classes, an error which historical development through the parliamentary and governmental crisis of the ruling class then corrects and goes beyond. That is, it is possible that the political class might commit an error. Okay? And if you commit an error, now then you have to account for it. You commit an error, you can identify that error and you can correct that error and go beyond. But if you accept that the relation between base and superstructure is deterministic and mechanical, then, says Gramsci, mechanical historical materialism does not allow for the possibility of error, but assumes that every political act is determined immediately by the structure and therefore as a real and permanent modification of the structure. Incidentally, the idea of error that the political dominant class might make is what made Gramsci a persona non grata within some orthodox Marxist circles. Okay, because these ruling Marxist leaders do not want to accept that they are capable of committing a mistake. Now, I think they did not understand Gramsci properly. Not just at the level of this instance, but what Gramsci seems to be doing for Marxism as a whole. Because if you accept the concept of error as pointed out by Gramsci, then you can save Marxism from relapsing into disguised divinity. What is the difference between divinity and humanity? In divinity, the God does not make a mistake. Okay, if you make human-centered systems, which Marxism is, as errorless, then there is little difference between divinity and humanism. Okay, now I think what Gramsci is doing is, by bringing the concept of error, he is saving Marxism from relapsing into disguised divinity. I think many Marxists, the orthodox Marxists, did not see the kind of movement that Gramsci is making in bringing his notion of error. The third point that he makes is that sometimes leaders do commit a mistake. They make deliberately certain actions which are not allowed, not because they want to make those actions, but because they would find it necessary for organizational requirements. Sometimes I have to tell certain lies, I have to make certain actions, even though I know that they are not ethically correct actions, they are not the ones which are allowed by the government. Okay. However, I still do it because of the organizational requirement. But Gramsci's point is that you may do these things, but you should know that you are doing it. Okay, you should not hide it from at least some sections of people. You should not tell lies, or you should not deceive yourself that you are beyond error and you will not commit a mistake. Thinking that whatever we have done is correct and we have never committed a mistake is what cost Marxism certain things like Stalinism and other kind of totalitarian regimes. I think what governs the totalitarian regime is not that all that they do is correct, but the tendency that they seems to have followed, namely, since we have done it, it is correct. The next point that Gramsci makes is that when base changes from B1 to B2, okay, it is true that superstructure also changes from S1 to S2, but it does not mean that everything that are there in the S1 will disappear and then a B1 and S2 takes everything from B2. He says that when B1 shifts to B2, many things from S1, or at least some things from S1, will survive in S2. He gives the example of how, for instance, Catholic religion survived in Soviet Russia. Okay, yes, the communist regime did not promote Christianity, they rejected it, and then they went, in fact, against it. Despite that, there is lot of religion that remained, which is an example that Gramsci shows, that goes in favor of saying that even when there is a change from base from one to the other thing, many things from superstructure, earlier superstructure, can survive. Okay, that's the another point that he makes. Hence, since they survive, there is no deterministic relation between base and superstructure. That does not mean that he says that base does not influence the superstructure. For Gramsci, base is the major, influencing factor, major controlling factor. He is only pitching on the semantics of the word determinism, and explicating the hermeneutical, senses of this word in its various uses. Now, then he goes on to make this point, saying that you have, on the one hand, those who argue that everything is determined by the economy. On the other hand, you have people who argue that ideology has hegemony over people. He says, now, it is not true that it is either economic determinism or ideological hegemony. He says that they are both in operation. Both are in operation, and he says that they are in a dialectical relation. But then there is something very, very interesting that he makes, which is very difficult to decipher. Namely, he says that dialectical nexus between the two categories of movement, namely the base to superstructure and superstructure to base, and therefore of research, is hard to establish precisely. In other words, what is clear in this statement of Gramsci is that both base and superstructure are active. Base is operating on superstructure and superstructure is operating on base. However, it is very difficult to ascertain which is dominating more and which is dominating less. He would say base is dominating more, but how much domination would he allow to superstructure? He leaves it open. He doesn't specify. That's something that one needs to think more when reading Gramsci. The second important point that he makes, which is also a last point that I want to make it in this module, is he says that when there is a change in the base, the influence that it can have over superstructure, he compares it with the modern warfare, the trench system of modern warfare. He says, I quote, "The superstructures of civil society are like the trench systems of modern warfare. In war, it would sometimes happen that the fierce artillery attacks seem to have destroyed the enemy's entire defensive system, whereas in fact, it had only destroyed the outer perimeter. And at the moment of their advance and attack, the assailants would find themselves confronted by a line of defense which was still effective. The same thing happens in politics during great economic crisis." In other words, it is not that once your trenches barge into the center of your enemy territory, you should not be complacent that you have won your enemy, because the enemy may be hiding at the borders, and after allowing you to enter into the center, the enemy might attack you from the border and then defeat you. So he is saying that you should not be complacent about the fact that the base determines the superstructure. If you become complacent, then there is a possibility that what happens in a trench system of modern warfare can happen even in the social sphere. So, to sum up, what Gramsci seems to be advocating is that there is ample evidence within Marx and Engels to come up with a non-deterministic or semantically varied understanding of the word determinism, and not take determinism as merely mechanical, merely causal, that renders to reductionism. He, in the process, salvages or retrieves the pregnant hermeneutical dimensions that are available in Marx. We will now look at the other important post-structuralist philosopher, Althusser. Having looked at Gramsci's relook at the relation between base and superstructure, where he added a hermeneutical dimension to the relation between base and superstructure, in addition to the mechanical relation that was prevalent during that time. Now let us look at another important post-structuralist in the form of Louis Althusser. Althusser, too, like Gramsci, declared that he is a committed Marxist and he would not deviate an inch away from Marx. Having made this claim, he goes on to show some important resources where through Marx or using Marx, there is a way you can bring out an entirely different interpretation of the relation between base and superstructure. So you have in front of you two versions. One, the relation between base and superstructure is governed by determinism, and the relation is mechanical, and it is also causal. And in addition to that, and not necessarily in place of it, you have another version where people like Althusser, using the material from Marx, come up with a non-deterministic, non-causal, non-mechanical interpretation of the relation between base and superstructure. I think there is something very interesting in this feat or in this intellectual gymnasium. And let us look at how Althusser goes about doing this in a systematic way. Althusser seems to begin by asking us this question: is it possible to have a deterministic relation when you have two variables which are not intact? Okay, if a relation has to be deterministic between two variables, then you should have variable 1 and variable 2 presented to you, given to you as a whole. They cannot be given to you or presented to you in a loose way, in an assorted way, in an open-ended way. You have to have them in a closed way, Now, Althusser says that the idea of social whole in Marx is quite distinct from the Hegelian totality. Okay? In Hegel, the society is presented as a whole. Okay? But in Marx, the social whole is not given to you as a whole, closed whole, self-enclosed whole. Marx conceives of the structure of every society as constituted by levels or instances. In other words, there is already a dent to the idea of a whole. The whole is not presented to you as a whole, intact, together. It consists of different levels or instances. Okay, now the superstructure itself contains two levels or instances. So even the superstructure that is alleged to be determined by the base is not another whole. If superstructure is not a whole, or the base is not a whole, then the process between them or the relation between them, that is base as not necessarily a whole, superstructure as not necessarily a whole gets tainted. It does not lend itself to deterministic conclusions. So, superstructure itself contains two levels or instances. What are these two levels? You have one level which is politico-legal. That is, a superstructure has a law and a state on the one hand in its totality, and ideology. The different ideologies which consist of religion, ethical, legal, political, and so on, so forth. So you have superstructure not given to you as a whole, but consisting of two levels, the politico-legal and the ideological. So he says, if you do not have a base as a whole and superstructure as a whole, okay, then what you at most can have is not a deterministic relation between base and superstructure, but he claims that superstructure can have a relative autonomy. That is, there may be instances where base does not determine superstructure. So Althusser is not saying that base does not impact the superstructure. It enormously impacts, but the point that he is making is it does not totally impact. Okay, there is a difference between enormously impacting it and totally impacting it. If you want to claim that the relation between base and superstructure is deterministic, what you need is not enormously impacting but totally impacting. And according to Althusser, the total impact is not possible. If total impact is not possible and total impact is necessary to claim that the relation is deterministic, then you don't have it here. So that's the first point that Althusser makes. Having made a dent into the deterministic relation between base and superstructure, he goes on to make a next step where he says, at times, it is not only that superstructure remains unaffected by base and has a relative autonomy, it also has a reciprocal interaction with the base. In other words, that in addition to base massively impacting the superstructure, at times superstructure may have impact on the base in turn. Now, he then goes on to make something very, very fascinating, and it is so fascinating that this move has become a trendsetter in literary studies, in cultural studies, in order to make sense of many things that they were researching on. He uses this term called metaphor. Okay. And then he says, when Marx talked about base and superstructure, the relation between base and superstructure is used by Marx as a metaphor. If the relation between base and superstructure is metaphor, what actually it would mean is that the base in the last instance determines the whole edifice, not each and every time, and not every time in a totalistic manner. That eventually it is the base that has an impact on the whole edifice. Okay. The greatest disadvantage of this representation of the structure of every society by the spatial metaphor of an edifice is obviously the fact that it is metaphorical, that is, it remains descriptive. The metaphor is used to describe the complexity of the relation. So he says that the relation between base and superstructure can be presented differently, can be presented as non-mechanical and as metaphorical. From this, it does not mean that he rejects the classical metaphor, or that metaphor itself requires that we go beyond it. This is the important point that Althusser makes, that he says that if something is metaphorical, then metaphor by its very nature pushes you to go beyond it. Now, you are not going beyond it because you are trespassing. You are going beyond it because it is a metaphor that makes you to go beyond it by its very nature. So he says that I am not going beyond it in order to reject it as outworn. I simply want to attempt to think what it gives us in the form of description. I think this is a brilliant way of re-looking at Marx and bringing a hermeneutical dimension into him and undermine in the process the totalistic and reductionistic claims of determinism attributed to the relation between base and superstructure. Next. State, he says, is explicitly conceived as a repressive apparatus. Thus, the definition of the state as a class existing in the repressive state apparatus cast a brilliant light on all the facets observable in the various orders of the repression, whatever their domain. So, it is in this context, he says, that there is a further need to distinguish state power from state operators. This is a brilliant distinction which has an enormous implications. He says that there can be an instance where a political party overthrows the previous political party and captures power. Now, when you capture power, okay, you will not be able to bring revolution according to Althusser because you have not dismantled the state operators. In other words, if you merely remove the agent who had power earlier and capture that power, but retain the infrastructure, the apparatus, the entire infrastructure of the state that was there earlier, you would be forced to replicate the same kind of hegemony, same kind of instance of violence which your opponent earlier was unleashing. So the point that he makes is that there is a need to distinguish between state power and state apparatus, and one should not be contented in merely replacing state power and retaining unwittingly sometimes the state apparatus. There is a need to dismantle all the state operators that were there earlier. Only then you will be able to bring revolution. This is one of the important points. In fact, it goes against certain practices of the communist societies who were only contented to capture power, take power, and then started using same operators, whether it is the police, whether it is the law, whether it is education institutions and other things. Althusser warned against those people who were complicit about this. So, to elaborate more on this state power and state operators, we know that the state operators may survive as is provided by the bourgeois revolutions in 19th century France. The collapse of the state without the state operators being affected or modified. Even after the social revolution like that of 1917, Althusser says or reminds us, a large part of the state operators survived. Let me now discuss what he means by state power. State power for Althusser consists of government, administration, army, police, courts, prisons, and all these institutions, according to him, they function by violence. In contrast, the repressive state operators, which he calls as ideological state operators, are certain number of realities which present themselves to the immediate observer in the form of distinct and specialized institutions. And these ideological state operators are religion, education, private schools, family, legal, political institutions, trade unions, communications, cultural organizations. So he says that the state operators or state power is one. The police is one with the state, the judiciary is one with the state, and the courts are one, and prisons are one. They work, there is a uniformity about them. But ideological state operators is diverse. There is pluralism in the ideological state operators. And then he goes on to say that the ideological state operators belongs to the private domain, whereas the repressive state operators belongs to the public domain. And then he says the repressive state operators like police, judiciary and other function by violence, whereas the ideological state operators function by ideology. Repressive state operators functions massively and predominantly by repressing while functioning secondarily by violence. That's why the police or the judiciary will begin to repress people, but then if they fail, then they would try to use ideology in order to get what they wanted to get. Ideological state operators massively and predominantly function by ideology, but they also function secondarily by repression. That when the ideological state operators will begin to persuade and oppress people through a persuasive manner, but when they know that they will not get the results done, then they will resort to the repression. So Althusser says that to his knowledge, no class can hold state power for a long period without at the same time exercising its hegemony over and in the state operators. So the summary of this detailed discussion by Althusser is all state authorities function both by repression and by ideology, with the difference that the repressive state authority functions massively and predominantly by ideology, whereas the repressive state apparatus constitutes an organized whole whose different parts are centralized beneath a commanding unity. The ideological state apparatus are multiple, distinct, relatively autonomous, whereas the unity of the repressive state apparatus is severed by its unified and centralized organization under the leadership of the representatives of the classes in power. The unity of the different ideological state operators is secured, usually in contradictory forms, by the ruling ideology, the ideology of the ruling classes. So what you have in front of you is the important intervention made by two important stalwarts, Gramsci and Althusser, who remained within Marxism but brought up something entirely different, using insights and the statements and ideas from Marx. They presented the relation between the base and superstructure as non-deterministic, non-causal and non-mechanical. This, I think, is one of the achievements of Althusser and Gramsci. Somebody might say that they have not presented, they have deviated from Marx, but then somebody else can argue that it is they who enriched Marx and took him out of the reductionistic, the mechanical way of theorizing social reality. Thank you.